Hi, and welcome to the Ministry Network podcast. I'm your host, James Baird. Today, we'll be speaking with Pastor Champ Thornton. Ministry Network just launched a new teaching series called Behind the Pulpit. You can learn about pastoral ministry from leaders like John Piper, Tim Keller, Alistair Begg, and so many more. Visit ministrynetwork.com/behind the pulpit to learn more. Now, let's talk with Pastor Thornton. Pastor Thornton, thanks so much for joining us here today on Ministry Network.
James, it's great to be with you. I have been looking forward to this.
Me too. Well, you've written a wonderful book entitled Radically Different. Can you tell us the story that led to your writing it?
So the subtitle of the book is A Student's Guide to Community. But I have to tell you, and don't tell anybody else, but it's really not exactly about community. So it's a bit of a surprise, but the book is really more about worldview, and we look at community through the lens of worldview. So here's the story there. About 10 to 12 years ago, I was reading a book that was recommended to me called Creation Regained. It's by Albert Wolters. And it's a typical worldview kind of book where there's a chapter on creation and then fall, then redemption and new creation. But as I read it, I started to realize that these categories apply not just to the story of Scripture, kind of from Genesis to Revelation, but actually they form a grid for how we view all of life. So I love how one pastor, a friend of mine in California, has summarized creation, fall, redemption, new creation. He calls it good, bad, new, perfect, which I think is perfect. And so I'll tell classes when I teach, if you want to be able to summarize the Bible in 4 words, here you go. Good, bad, new, perfect. But it's not just a summary of the Bible. It's a grid for how we view all of life through the lens of the Bible. So for example, when we want to think about anything in life, like sports, for example, it's good because God made it. There's something flawed because it's touched by the fall. Jesus came to redeem everything in life, including our athletics. And one day, I'll actually be a decent soccer player in the new creation, but not yet. And so we can look at all of life through this grid, good, bad, new, perfect. So we can look at sports, we can look at work, we can look at tech, we can look at entertainment, and, germane to your question, we can look at relationships or community through this grid as well. And so this book, the story here is, I want the next generation, including middle schoolers, which this is where that book's mainly aimed, to think about relationships through this grid. And for the book, I compressed it just to good, bad, and new. And so how do we process relationships through those lenses?
Yeah, that's awesome. I love the fact that you used relationships, community as the entryway for this model. Can you kind of unpack your logic there a little bit? Why was that the best place to start for middle schoolers in particular?
Well, I have a youth pastor friend of mine who says when it comes to relationships, teenagers, they're terrible at it. And, you just laugh and go, yeah. And not only because we see it in others, but probably because we remember ourselves at that age. But I think the reason it's so difficult is because, first of all, just at any age, relationships are complicated. And so when we think about relationships and the need for processing it biblically, all of us need all the help we can get. Secondly, young people, teenagers, middle schoolers, high schoolers, there's a growing awareness of life outside themselves. So it's fun to see kids go into, let's say, youth group or into middle school. And honestly, a lot of them aren't very aware of themselves. They're just living life. And then it doesn't take too long and they realize, I've been an idiot. And they start to kind of draw back a little bit and be more aware of others. And usually I think girls are out in front than the boys on this. They are a little more aware earlier, maybe even before middle school. And then I think another complicating factor is this is an age of lots of changes, emotional changes, physiological changes, psychological changes, spiritual changes. There's development, they're growing, and they're going to need help navigating all these complexities. So I think we all need this kind of help, and the patterns they set at that age, chances are they're setting life trajectories about relationships. So I think it's a pivotal time, it's an important time, it's a difficult time, and we need all the help we can get.
That's so good. Well, let's dig in a little bit into how you break open for us and show the inner workings of the biblical model of community. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I don't really talk on this directly in the book Radically Different, but I love how Ed Welch talks about it in his book Side by Side. He basically breaks the book into two parts, and he says, let's start with community by talking about the fact that all of us are needy. All of us are needy. And the second half is biblical community works on the truth that all of us are needed, needy and needed. And so really this just draws right off of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians about the fact that the church we're a body and we're all made up of individual parts as a church. So, if I'm an eye, there are things I can't do. I need hands and feet and fingers. And at the same time, there are things that the other parts of the body can't do that God has given to me. And so we see both needy and needed. And so when I walk into a room, I'm going to know that every single person in the room is going to be needy. Now, I may be feeling, most of all, that I'm needy. That may be how I'm feeling deep inside that I may not tell anybody, especially if I'm, in middle or high school. But I'm needy and everybody else is too. So that may calm me down and help me actually to think, how can I help the people in front of me? If they're needy and they're needed, then I'm needed. And so these two realities go back and forth as we cycle through thinking about other people and what they need and how God can put me here to actually be a blessing to them and be blessed by them.
Yeah, that's such a helpful model. So helpful. So are there any particular struggles that young people face, especially as they're trying to grow in their relationship with God?
That's a great question. I wouldn't begin to assume that I've got the answer to this question, but here are some observations that might be helpful to some. So as we think about the teenage years, we think about middle school, high school, these are years, if things are working the way they should, where individuals and young people are moving away from their parents. I mean, that really is the goal, right? We don't want 30-year-olds at home in the basement with the video game, right? We want them to move out of the house eventually. So that's why there's a lot of friction in the teenage years, because you have this person who's becoming an adult, but they're not there yet. And so they're trying to become independent in an environment where they're not independent. And so they've got to realize this. The parents have to realize this. And so here they are, they're moving, hopefully smoothly, gradually, with love, away from their parents. And what does that mean for their relationship with God? They've learned about the Lord, God willing, from their parents. So are they going to adopt that as their own? Are they going to think on their own and say, this is not for me? Let's hope not. But it's a challenge in their walk with God because they are becoming individualized and they're differentiating from their parents. I think that's one thing. I think that means also parents, that it's vital that they stay engaged at that age with their teenagers, especially in spiritual things. I think they have to realize their role is going to change, that they need to be engaged, but then who at the church can be involved as well? I mean, there may be things that I tell my teenager that I don't know how many times I've said it, but we all know how it goes. Someone at church says it and our kids think that's the best thing ever. So, we need that community because they're growing out of the nest, as it were. I think another reason why it's difficult at that age is that as people grow at that age, they start to be aware that there's a world outside the home and that they perceive perhaps a gap between here's what I've been taught all my life at home, at church, and then there's this wider world that has no value at all on the things of the Lord. And they have to assess, how do the things that I've been taught and the things that I'm observing go together? And I think that's going to be a challenge. And again, I think this is where good communication and the church family as a body around these teenagers is going to be really, really useful.
That's great. So what about the relationships with others? Can you walk us through a healthy way to help students learn how to connect with parents, families, friends?
Yeah, so that's a huge question. Let's take in some of its breadth by just backing up a few steps. When I talk to my kids about what maturity looks like, and this admittedly isn't specifically Christian maturity, although it would include that. It is, I think, maturity more in general as a human being. But it is Christian when we go to the Bible. And that is, I tell my kids, maturity looks like moving toward people and problems in love and wisdom.
Oof.
Okay, moving toward people and problems in love and wisdom. So let me unpack that a second, and then I want to apply it to parents and apply it to kids. So we move toward, right? Immaturity says, I'm just going to sit here. Immaturity says, I'm backing away. Maturity says, I'm taking initiative. God moved toward us. We move toward others. We move toward people. We're not just interested in moving toward the thing that we're interested in, whether it's a hobby or an activity. We are interested in people. Maturity moves toward people, but it also moves toward problems. It doesn't try to just enjoy friends. It also engages with things that are difficult. But we do it in love. So there's passive-aggressive ways to move toward people and problems. Christianity says, no, we move toward people and problems, and we do it in a loving way. I'm not just interested in fixing your problems. I'm interested in you. And in wisdom. Sometimes moving toward people or moving toward a problem would actually be folly. So, there may be people you meet on the street that seems kind of dangerous. Wisdom might mean we don't move toward that person in this particular scenario. So I think all these words count. We move toward people and problems in love and in wisdom. Now, when we think about how this applies to parents, we have to keep moving toward our kids. So they're getting older. It's easier to think a little bit on autopilot. I don't have to engage quite as much as when they were younger. I certainly don't have to feed them anymore or help them put their clothes on. And we have to stay engaged, move toward people and move toward problems. I mean, it's not fun having not fun conversations, but that's our job. And so we have regular check-ins with our kids. Sometimes as families are able, we do that separately because kids are going to interact differently, maybe with mom or with dad. And we want to be able to have a full range of openness and conversation. They need to know that they're heard. We need to hear what they're thinking. We need to draw them out. So that's for parents. I think for teens as well, we want to encourage them to start doing it. How are you moving toward people on Sunday morning in love and wisdom? How are you moving toward problems in your room, at school, in life? Are you moving toward those problems, or are you just kind of ignoring them, hoping they'll go away? So we want to push them outside themselves and remind them, okay, remember, maturity looks like moving toward people and problems in love and wisdom.
Yeah. Man, can you cross-stitch that on a pillow for me? I love that saying. That's so good. So at their best, relationships are wonderful. I mean, that's clearly embedded in your idea of moving towards people. But when they break down, it is tough. Can you help us understand that dynamic?
Well, I want to go back to good, bad, and new. So this is where Creation Regained, I mentioned by Albert Wolters, was really helpful to me. And it's just a reminder that, yes, all relationships have some good in them because God made relationships, and yet they're all broken. And there's an analogy that comes to mind of like a block of marble. So here you have a block of marble, and let's say it's got white veins through it. It's got black veins through it. And so there's this mix of light and dark. So it's a mix, as it were, of good and bad. And so everything in this world, everything created is like a block of marble. Now, sometimes it may be there's more white and less dark. Sometimes there's more dark and less white. But it's all a combination. And we can never just transfer from one broken relationship to a non-broken relationship because they're all broken. All relationships are marbled. And so this applies to everything. So we talked earlier about sports and tech and entertainment and work and relationships. You're never going to trade a broken job for a non-broken job. You're never going to trade a broken church for a non-broken church. It's all marble. And so when we come to grips with this, it really helps us have a realistic view of the world we live in. And, we don't try to solve every problem like we do when we're in, Microsoft Windows. It's like, there's a problem. What do we do? Well, we reboot. Well, there's no rebooting, right? It's like everything's marbled. And so I think, yes, relationships are wonderful, but sometimes they're broken. Why is that? Because they're all broken. James, let me add as well that related to parents, kids need to know this. Because if they forget that their parents are good and made in the image of God, then they could be dismissive of their parents in a way they shouldn't be. If, on the other hand, they just forget, you remember, your parents are sinners too, they could become very cynical and dismissive. And then they need to remember that Jesus died for them. And so, let's have realistic expectations of our parents. Is like they're growing in grace just like you are. And so I think it applies very specifically to my children. My kids need to remember that good, bad, and new apply to mom and dad.
So helpful. So your book also talks about keeping a balance in challenging relationships. Could you outline this model for us and share how we should apply it?
So here I'm ripping off shamelessly from a model from Peacemaker Ministries, and they talk about 3 ways you can handle problems or problem relationships, or really any kind of relationship. And that is, first, there's a peace breaker. And what they mean by that is this is someone who their default setting is going to be aggressive. They're going to say, you mess with me, I'm coming back at you. And it's not kind, it's not loving, it's aggressive. To whatever degree. Maybe it's a little bit, maybe it's a lot. That's a peace breaker. Then there's the peace faker. This is the person who's more passive. They're just going to say, no, it's okay, everything's fine, when it's not. And sometimes they do that a little bit, and sometimes that's just their MO. They are all about keeping the peace at any cost. Then there's the third option, which is the one you want, which is the peacemaker, which is, yes, I'm going to address a problem, but I'm going to do it in a way that's not aggressive. So I think the key here is what Jesus says about how we need to handle problems in relationships. It's we want to focus on the other person's problem and not focus on the log in our own eye. So what's interesting here, though, is yes, we first focus on our own problems. We're broken. And I will say that actually really helps in relationships. When there's been an argument that I've had with my wife, if I go back to her leading with, here's where I sinned and I could see where that hurt you, man, that conversation is going to go way better than if I handle it another way. Okay, so it's very wise and useful in relationships. But also, not only do I need to focus on my own sin first, my own brokenness, but then that doesn't stop there. Jesus said, take the log out of your own eye so that you can see clearly to help the person with their splinter, their speck in their eye. And so here is not a person who's just, I'm not going to mess with anybody else. This is a problem. Oh, well. No, I'm going to be engaged with the other person. I'm moving toward people and problems in love and wisdom. But first, that means I'm going to deal with my own problems and approach them in humility.
That's great. So what role do parents play in teaching their children about community and relationships?
So 3 things come to mind. First is parents, you got to teach. So you got to open your mouth. You've got to say, let me help interpret the world for you. I was just talking to a friend of mine this morning about how we need to notice, even in the Garden of Eden. So here's the perfect man and the perfect woman in the perfect place. And you would think they would know how to live. And yet God, what does he do? He tells them, he gives them special revelation. He verbally communicates about the world he's made. And he says, this is how you live here. You're not going to do this. You're not going to do that. I want you to do this. I don't want you to do that. And so if that's what the Lord knows we need in the perfect scenario, we need to be interpreting life for our kids in a very unperfect scenario, which is all of life. So parents, go to Deuteronomy 6, when you're getting up in the morning, making breakfast, in the car, talk, teach, teach, teach. Second, you got to model it. So if you say, hey, you need to move toward people and problems in love and wisdom. All right, Dad, how you doing that? Okay. How are we doing this as a family? Are we engaging with people? Or do we sweep things under the rug? Do we go and say, I was wrong, would you forgive me? Do we work at being peacemakers? How are we modeling these things ourselves? And then third, I think, is what comes to mind is the value here of integrity. In other words, keeping the gap between what we teach and what we model close. I think this is important because there's been a lot of talk in recent days about kids walking away from the faith, walking away from the church. And I don't think anybody can legitimately say, here, I've got the solution for that, or I know what's wrong. But I think when we start saying things like, they need to know the evidences for Christianity, they need to know that Christianity is true and valid and right. What we tend to think at that point is, I need to send them to a worldview seminar. I need to let them listen to these recordings or read this book on why we can trust the Bible. And all those things are incredibly useful. But there is a apologetic that is more than just about dates and manuscripts and giving an answer. There's an apologetic that flows out of a life. So when my words say, Jesus is Lord, but the priorities of my life don't reflect that, should I really expect my teenager to just say, oh, That's right. That's true. That's real, right? So the goal here isn't perfection, because even when we fail, we show the validity and the authenticity of Christianity by going and saying, I failed. I was wrong. So it's not perfection, but it's an integrity that communicates Christianity is real. Jesus is Lord. We are dealing with life and death here. This isn't just some nice thing we do on Sundays. So what role do parents play in this next generation in helping them with community and relationships? Teach, model, and integrity.
So let's zoom out a little bit and focus on another piece of community, which is the role of church. So not every church offers, these great, robust opportunities for students to develop and grow in their relationships. But how might a pastor navigate building those sorts of opportunities into their church?
I feel like this past year has made all the questions about community just seem all that harder to answer in a church context. All the ways we thought about community just, disappeared. We don't know where they are. They're coming back slowly. So at the same time, this past year has pushed us all to think about these things in church life, whether it's community or fellowship or whatever we're doing, less in terms of events and more in terms of elements. So we might say, let's have something that really helps our kids with fellowship. And now we're thinking, okay, who are their friends? Who can they be friends to? How are they learning social interaction? Where are they receiving encouragement from peers and others? How can they find support and help? Where can they hear good, solid teaching? And it may be that instead of getting those all bundled up in 1 4-hour block on a Friday night at church or a Sunday morning, it may be that these are broken out into various components. That, families are connecting with maybe 1 or 2 other families, and that covers a couple of these elements in relationships. Church is able to provide a couple of these relationships. Maybe a school context provides others, neighbors, family. So I think it's helpful in a time like we're in right now and have been in for some time to start thinking in terms of what are the elements and goals that I want to accomplish, as opposed to just thinking, I know the church is going to provide all this. I'm not sure that's going to be realistic, at least for some time.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Because it also just points out, sometimes it's easy to say, hey, one of our big priorities for the church this year is we're going to have a new discipleship program, which is great, often can be really powerful. But it's easy to forget that it always starts with your next conversation.
Right. Yeah, what's the next step you need to take?
Yeah, that's great. So as we're wrapping up here, what would you say is your final word of encouragement to pastors, teachers, and others seeking to help students form godly communities?
James, I'm reminded about how Paul closes his letter to the church in Rome. So remember, this is a church that he's never visited. Now, he knows some of their names. We know that from the last chapter in the book, but he's never been there. He didn't have a direct part in founding it. So this is not direct information. He didn't have a direct role in their discipleship. And he says something very interesting in chapter 15, verse 14. He says, I'm convinced about you that you are full of all goodness and filled with all knowledge and therefore able to admonish one another. So this is a very relational verse, right? You have the ability to engage with other people in a way that helps them, strengthens them, redirects them. So he says, you have this ability. I'm convinced of it. I mean, he's very, very optimistic. And yet this is the Paul who in chapters 14 and 15 and in other places in this same letter takes these believers to the woodshed and says, when you get together, you got to stop behaving in certain ways. Like you need to admonish one another in godly and wise and loving ways. So all at the same time, he's very optimistic about what God has given them the ability to do. And yet he's also saying, you need to make sure that you are interacting with other people in wise and loving ways. And this is just like what he says in 1 Thessalonians. He tells them, you are taught by God to love one another. God's taught you this. The Spirit has given you the ability to do this. And in fact, you are doing this. You are loving one another. And then he turns right around and says, so keep it up. Do more and more. So think about these dynamics. Paul is saying, God has given you the ability to relate in love, even to admonish. He's given you this ability. So if a teenager is a child of God, they have the ability to relate. They have the ability to engage in community in a wise and loving and godly way. And yet, parents have a responsibility and pastors have a responsibility to say, and remember to do it. So there's this dynamic where we're very optimistic, and yet we urge, we exhort, we say, please be about this. So in other words, God made you for community, and he's going to help you to do it. But you've got to dive in. You've got to take action. Both those things go together. I don't know how they go together in God's mysterious, sovereign designs, but they go together. So a final word of encouragement: encourage the teenagers around you to engage, knowing that God's given them the ability to do it.
Pastor Thornton, thank you so much for joining us here today. This was just a wonderful time.
James, it has been great to be with you and think about community together. So thanks for the invitation to do that.
Join us next time as we speak with Professor Brandon Crow. In the meantime, visit ministrynetwork.com/behind the pulpit to learn about our new teaching series.